The world thought they knew the story. Meghan Markle, beloved by some, reviled by others, had presented a narrative so polished, so precise, that almost no one dared question it publicly. She had shared with the world the existence of her daughter, Lilibet Diana, a name that instantly drew intrigue, curiosity, and a mixture of admiration and speculation. Yet behind the perfectly curated images, the sparkling anecdotes of motherhood, and the royal appearances carefully documented by paparazzi and social media alike, there was a shadow that no one dared follow. Until now. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if everything you believed about Lilibet Diana was a fabrication? What if the child everyone assumed to be the innocent princess of the new generation, born to a duchess who claimed to champion transparency and truth, was something entirely different, something constructed, manipulated, or perhaps entirely fictional? Imagine the shock, the disbelief, the betrayal. How would you even begin to process that? For weeks, investigators, journalists, and royal insiders have been piecing together a story that upends the very narrative Meghan herself put forward. A story that raises questions not just about her, but about the inner workings of the monarchy, the media machine, and the public's willingness to believe what they want to see. From the outset, this wasn't going to be a normal investigation. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A few whispers in Hollywood circles, a leaked document here, a cryptic social media post there. At first, no one took it seriously. After all, conspiracy theories abound around anyone remotely connected to the British royal family. But as the weeks went by, these whispers solidified into something more substantial. Corroborated evidence, eyewitness accounts, and documents that couldn't be dismissed as rumor. It became clear that this story was real, that it demanded attention, and that it would shatter assumptions. Meghan Markle had, for years, positioned herself as a figure of transparency and authenticity, particularly after the global scrutiny surrounding her relationship with Prince Harry. Every interview, every public statement, carefully crafted to project honesty, openness, and a willingness to break free from the suffocating chains of tradition. But what if the very symbol of her liberation, the child she presented to the world, was at the center of a story so convoluted and shocking that it threatened to undo everything she had built? That is the question that hung in the air as investigators dug deeper, uncovering inconsistencies, anomalies, and pieces of evidence that led to an unthinkable conclusion. Before we dive further, consider this. How often do we take the word of public figures at face value? How often do we accept the images, the statements, and the official narratives without question? Now, take that thought and multiply it by the power of the royal family, an institution that has historically controlled perception with meticulous precision. Every announcement, every photo, every handshake is scrutinized, curated, and deployed strategically. So when Meghan Markle revealed the existence of Lilibet Diana, the world reacted with a mixture of joy, curiosity, and fascination. Few, however, suspected that beneath the surface, a complex web of secrecy and perhaps manipulation was quietly taking shape. The investigation into Lilibet Diana's identity wasn't sparked by idle gossip. It was triggered by a series of unusual events that, taken together, painted a picture impossible to ignore. There were inconsistencies in documentation, alleged discrepancies in medical records, anonymous tips from individuals claiming insider knowledge. And then there were the legal maneuvers, quiet filings, protective orders, and measures taken to keep certain facts hidden from the public eye. These small, seemingly unrelated events formed a mosaic that investigators slowly pieced together, revealing a story that, until now, had remained hidden from public view. Some of the evidence came in the form of eyewitness accounts. Staff members, former aides, and close associates of the Duchess provided testimony that painted a picture of secrecy and careful control. In conversations that were off the record, they hinted at arrangements so meticulous and deliberate that the average person would struggle to comprehend them. Was Lilibet Diana truly present in the private moments captured on camera? Were there occasions when the child was substituted, replaced, or misrepresented? The questions were uncomfortable, unnerving, and difficult to process, but they demanded answers. And then there was the digital trail. In a world where almost every action leaves some trace, emails, text messages, photographs with timestamps, GPS metadata, it didn't take long for investigators to start following leads. Inconsistent social media posts, edited photos, and carefully worded statements began to reveal patterns. Patterns that suggested control, manipulation, and intentional obfuscation. Each piece of evidence raised more questions than it answered. Each discovery amplified the stakes. And, crucially, each clue led investigators closer to a conclusion that would shock the world. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the human element. The emotional weight carried by those involved, the parents, the staff, the extended family, added a complexity that went beyond facts and evidence. Emotions, motivations, and human desires have always shaped history, sometimes more powerfully than any document or recording. In this case, they created a volatile mixture, a perfect storm in which the truth was at once fragile, contested, and incredibly consequential. To understand the story of Lilibet Diana, one must not only follow the evidence, but also grasp the emotional currents running beneath it. The fear, the desperation, the hope, and, in some instances, the calculated decisions designed to protect a public image at all costs. This isn't a story with easy answers. It isn't a tale that fits neatly into a headline or a social media post. It's a tangled narrative of secrecy, media manipulation, and family dynamics that has remained invisible to the public eye until now. And yet, the implications are enormous. They touch on the credibility of one of the most scrutinized public figures of the 21st century, the integrity of an institution revered worldwide, and the public's understanding of truth in an era dominated by curated images and carefully constructed narratives. Now, imagine the tension, a child at the center of global attention, whose very identity is under question. The images you've seen, the interviews you've watched, the celebrations you've followed, how much of it was authentic? How much of it was staged, managed, or carefully orchestrated to convey a particular message? This is where the stakes rise beyond intrigue and speculation. Because if the investigation's findings are true, they call into question the nature of truth itself, the stories we are told, and the assumptions we carry about those we admire or vilify. And here's the kicker. Meghan Markle herself has now responded. After months of silence, after careful consideration and perhaps legal consultation, she has made a confession that is both shocking and unprecedented. It challenges long-held beliefs, undermines widely accepted narratives, and forces the public to confront uncomfortable questions about authenticity, truth, and deception. This confession is not just a personal revelation. It's a seismic event in the landscape of public perception, media, and royal history. But before we get to what she revealed, there's one more thing you need to understand. The story is layered. It is filled with contradictions, moments that defy logic, and twists that no one could have predicted. It is a story that alternates between joy and heartbreak, truth and deception, public image and private reality. And throughout, one question remains at the center, haunting every revelation, every whisper, and every document uncovered. Who, or what, is Lilibet Diana really? As we move forward, consider this. The world has been waiting for a confirmation, a revelation that will finally make sense of the chaos. And now it's here. But the answer is not straightforward. It is nuanced, shocking, and emotionally charged. It forces us to re-examine not just Meghan Markle, but the system she is entangled with, the narratives we consume, and the very nature of belief in a world where appearances are meticulously crafted and reality is often carefully hidden. The stakes could not be higher. Public opinion, familial reputation, legal ramifications, and emotional consequences all hang in the balance. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, there remains one undeniable truth. The world is about to learn something that will leave many stunned, questioning, and searching for answers. Because what Meghan confessed about Lilibet Diana is nothing like what anyone imagined, and the repercussions will echo far beyond the walls of palaces or the confines of celebrity coverage. And just when you think you have grasped it, just when the narrative seems to settle, another layer emerges. A new revelation, a startling contradiction, a piece of evidence that threatens to rewrite everything we thought we knew. It's a puzzle where every answer only leads to more questions, and every truth is accompanied by an equal measure of disbelief. So, as we begin this journey into the hidden world of Meghan Markle, Lilibet Diana, and the investigation that changed everything, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect an image? How much would you risk to maintain control over perception? And what would you do if the child you introduced to the world might not be who everyone thought she was? The answers lie ahead. But be warned, what comes next will challenge your assumptions, test your understanding, and leave you questioning not just one story, but the very stories we are told every day. Because in this tale of secrecy, deception, and revelation, the truth is stranger than fiction. And it is only just beginning to unfold. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For years, the British royal family had maintained a delicate balance between public image and private reality, a choreography so precise that even the slightest misstep could make global headlines. The existence of Lilibet Diana was supposed to be a straightforward story, a child born to a duchess, a symbol of continuity and hope, celebrated across media outlets, her every milestone documented with carefully staged photos. And yet, beneath the veneer of perfect portraits and heartwarming anecdotes, a different story quietly simmered. A story no one dared speak aloud. Until now. Have you ever wondered how much of what you see in public life is carefully curated, manipulated, or outright staged? The royal family operates on centuries of tradition, but behind the gilded gates and manicured gardens lies a culture of secrecy that rivals the most elaborate spy networks. Every gesture, every photograph, every announcement is meticulously planned. And when Meghan Markle entered the picture, bringing with her the scrutiny of Hollywood, social media, and relentless tabloids, the stakes skyrocketed. Suddenly, every detail about her life, and by extension, Lilibet Diana's, was under a microscope. The first cracks began to appear quietly. Insiders, speaking on the condition of anonymity, hinted at unusual occurrences surrounding the child. School records that didn't quite align, private nannies who gave conflicting accounts, moments captured on camera that seemed staged. These anomalies were subtle, almost imperceptible. To the casual observer, they might have seemed like nothing more than coincidence. But to those paying attention, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that suggested something far more deliberate than mere oversight. Consider this. The average public figure may have PR consultants, stylists, and media advisors managing their image. Meghan Markle, however, was operating on an entirely different level. She was a royal, a celebrity, a mother, and a symbol all at once. The narratives she crafted were not just about her. They were about the story she wanted the world to believe. And at the heart of this story was Lilibet Diana. Who was she really? Was she the innocent child presented to the public, or was she part of a carefully orchestrated plan to control perception, deflect scrutiny, and protect personal interests? Investigators soon discovered that even the most basic details about Lilibet's early life were inconsistent. Birth announcements, hospital records, and media reports showed discrepancies that could not be easily explained. Dates didn't always match, accounts from different staff members contradicted each other, and some photographic evidence appeared suspiciously edited. Was this merely human error, or was there a more deliberate effort to control the narrative? Every secret has a pattern, and every pattern leaves traces. Investigators followed these traces meticulously. They traced email correspondences, text messages, and digital footprints. They cross-referenced hospital records with social media posts, public appearances with travel logs, and even private interactions captured by security personnel. Slowly, a picture began to form, one that was at once fascinating, troubling, and utterly confounding. One former aide, speaking off the record, described the atmosphere surrounding Lilibet Diana as unusual, almost tense. The child was rarely seen in casual family settings. Public appearances were highly orchestrated, with specific angles, lighting, and positioning designed to create the perfect image. Questions were not permitted. Observers noted that even those responsible for her care seemed to operate under strict instructions. No deviation, no spontaneous moments, no unsanctioned interactions. It was as though the child was not simply a member of the family, but a carefully curated symbol, a piece in a larger game of perception. Yet, despite these anomalies, the public remained largely unaware. Images of a smiling child, playful moments captured by photographers, and curated social media updates maintained the illusion. People saw what they wanted to see: a happy family, a doting mother, a child growing up in the lap of privilege. The illusion was convincing, nearly flawless. But as with all illusions, cracks inevitably appear when examined closely, when facts are cross-checked, and when individuals with intimate knowledge begin to speak. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a series of anonymous tips led authorities to question the very existence of Lilibet Diana as a tangible, present child. Whispers suggested that some appearances attributed to the child might have been facilitated through stand-ins, edited video, or staged encounters. At first, this theory was dismissed as absurd. Could a public figure really go to such lengths? Could an entire public narrative be built around a figure who might not exist as portrayed? But the more investigators dug, the more anomalies they found. Timelines that didn't make sense, photographs that seemed inconsistent, and statements that contradicted each other. And then there were the legal measures. Files, protective orders, and filings appeared to indicate an unusual level of concern about what could be revealed. Confidential agreements with staff, non-disclosure contracts, and legal interventions raised more questions than answers. Were these measures standard for a royal family member, or were they specifically designed to control the story of Lilibet Diana? Were they a defensive mechanism against scrutiny, or an effort to suppress a truth the public was not meant to know? The deeper the investigation went, the more the story became about control. Control of perception, control of information, and control of narrative. And at the center of it all stood Meghan Markle, navigating the pressures of public life, family expectations, and personal reputation. Her role in crafting and maintaining the narrative of Lilibet Diana became increasingly significant. Every interview she gave, every photograph shared, every story she told added another layer to the intricate web that investigators were now painstakingly unraveling. But there were human costs to this level of secrecy and control. Emotional accounts from insiders revealed the strain on staff, the tension within the family, and the psychological weight carried by those closest to the situation. For them, maintaining appearances was not merely a professional requirement. It was a moral and emotional burden. The child, Lilibet Diana, whether real or constructed in part, was at the center of a maelstrom of secrecy that affected everyone involved. As evidence accumulated, investigators faced a chilling realization. This was no longer simply a story about a child or a family secret. It had become a study of human behavior under extreme conditions of scrutiny and manipulation. It was about the lengths people would go to protect image, to control narrative, and to shield themselves from judgment. And it was about what happens when truth becomes malleable, when reality is shaped not by fact, but by perception. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to grow up under such conditions. A child whose presence is carefully managed, whose interactions are scripted, whose very existence is potentially a subject of speculation and manipulation. It's a psychological landscape few could navigate, yet it was precisely the environment that surrounded Lilibet Diana. And the consequences of that environment, both immediate and long-term, were profound. By now, the pattern was undeniable. The investigation revealed not just discrepancies, but a coordinated effort to present a specific narrative to the public. Images were staged, statements were curated, and appearances were orchestrated with military-like precision. Every element contributed to the illusion of normalcy, the story of a happy child and devoted mother. But beneath that facade was a reality far more complex, far more controlled, and far more consequential than anyone outside the inner circle could have imagined. And here is where the tension reached its peak. Investigators had begun to piece together a timeline that challenged everything previously believed. Every public appearance, every social media post, every reported milestone in Lilibet Diana's life was scrutinized and analyzed. Patterns emerged that suggested deliberate construction, timing, and orchestration designed to shape perception. These were not casual inconsistencies. They were signs of intentional control, manipulation, and possibly even deception. What does it mean when the child at the center of such global attention may not be exactly as presented? How do we reconcile the images, the interviews, the narratives we have been fed, with evidence suggesting otherwise? For the public, the cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable. For the investigators, it is a puzzle with layers still waiting to be fully understood. And for Meghan Markle, it is a story she now faces, the story of Lilibet Diana, a narrative that she has shaped, controlled, and ultimately will have to confront publicly. As the first chapter of the investigation closes, the implications are staggering. This is not a mere family controversy, nor is it a simple tale of media intrigue. It is a high-stakes story that touches on identity, perception, control, and the fragile line between reality and narrative. And the most shocking part is yet to come, the very confession that will force the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew about Lilibet Diana. But just when investigators thought they had mapped the contours of the secret, a new revelation surfaced, one that would force everyone to pause, question, and brace for a truth so unsettling that it threatened to upend not just the narrative of a child, but the public perception of an entire family. What came next would redefine the story, and no one outside the inner circle was prepared for it. But just when investigators thought they had mapped the contours of the secret, a new revelation surfaced, one that would force everyone to pause, question, and brace for a truth so unsettling that it threatened to upend not just the narrative of a child, but the public perception of an entire family. What came next would redefine the story, and no one outside the inner circle was prepared for it. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to carry a secret so monumental, so potentially devastating, that the very act of sharing it could change the course of your life? Imagine holding in your hands a truth that could topple reputations, shatter carefully constructed images, and send shockwaves across the globe. That is the weight Meghan Markle carried when she made her private confession, an admission that until that moment had remained locked away, hidden beneath layers of strategy, discretion, and deliberate silence. The confession didn't happen in public, of course. This was not an interview staged for camera lights or a carefully timed press release designed for maximum impact. No, this was a moment that occurred behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the world, where Meghan confronted the reality of what had been orchestrated and what had been presented to the world as truth. It was intimate, guarded, and fraught with tension, an environment that left little room for error, emotion unchecked, or misstatement unnoticed. What exactly did she reveal? That is the question that has haunted the investigation ever since. For weeks, sources with direct knowledge of the conversation have hinted at the contours of her disclosure. They describe a scene tense with emotion, where Meghan navigated a labyrinth of admissions, omissions, and careful clarifications. She spoke of Lilibet Diana not just as a child, but as a symbol, a construct shaped by narrative, image, and perception. And in doing so, she acknowledged the complexities and contradictions that had long been whispered in private circles but never confirmed publicly. Consider for a moment the courage it must have taken to make such a confession, to admit that a story so central to her public identity, so intertwined with her persona as a mother and a public figure, was not entirely what it seemed. Every word weighed heavily, every phrase was measured, every silence pregnant with significance. And yet, despite the pressure, she chose to speak, perhaps driven by conscience, perhaps by inevitability, or perhaps by the relentless scrutiny that made silence impossible. According to insiders, the confession unfolded in layers. The first layer was an acknowledgement of perception, the recognition that the public had been shown one version of reality, carefully curated, strategically staged, and selectively edited. Meghan admitted that certain appearances had been managed with extraordinary precision. The angles, the timing, even the presence of cameras were orchestrated to convey the narrative she wanted the world to believe. These weren't casual moments captured by chance. They were deliberate, calculated, and, in some instances, intentionally misleading. But that was only the beginning. The second layer, far more shocking, involved the reality of presence and identity. Details emerged suggesting that some of the appearances attributed to Lilibet Diana may have involved intermediaries, stand-ins, or representations designed to maintain continuity of narrative. This is not to say the child did not exist, but rather that her public presentation had been managed in ways that blurred the line between reality and performance. For those who saw only images, the truth was hidden in plain sight, concealed by timing, editing, and context. The third layer added an emotional dimension that few could have anticipated. Meghan spoke of the internal conflict, the tension between protecting a child, safeguarding personal privacy, and navigating the expectations of a global audience. She described feelings of guilt, fear, and isolation, emotions intensified by the weight of public judgment. Imagine being trapped between the demands of truth and the necessity of protection, where every choice carried consequences not just for yourself, but for the child at the center of the storm. In the midst of this revelation, investigators noted a striking pattern. The confession was not a single disclosure, but a cascade of admissions, each building on the previous one, each adding a layer of complexity and emotional resonance. There were moments of candid reflection, moments of defensiveness, and moments where the enormity of the situation seemed to overwhelm even her carefully controlled demeanor. It was human, raw, and compelling, a side of Meghan Markle the public rarely saw, filtered through decades of media narratives, royal protocols, and celebrity mystique. Now, let's pause and ask ourselves a question. What would you do if your life, your public persona, and the very reality of your child were under relentless scrutiny? How do you navigate a world where perception is often more powerful than fact, and where every misstep, every hesitation, could be amplified, misconstrued, or weaponized? Meghan's confession is a window into that reality, a glimpse behind the curtain, revealing not just facts, but the human toll of navigating a world obsessed with image, narrative, and control. The confession also shed light on another, equally surprising dimension: the role of intermediaries. Advisors, staff, and trusted aides played critical roles in managing appearances, guiding public perception, and, in some cases, ensuring that inconsistencies went unnoticed. These were professionals tasked with controlling narrative, balancing legal considerations, and maintaining emotional equilibrium in a high-stakes environment. The revelation highlighted the intricate web of people involved, each with their own motivations, loyalties, and stakes in the unfolding story. And then there were the contradictions. Sources describe moments where Meghan's words appeared to conflict, where explanations seemed at odds with documented timelines, and where the narrative she presented was intentionally ambiguous. These contradictions are not accidental. They reflect the complexity of managing truth in a context where disclosure could have profound personal, legal, and public ramifications. For investigators, the contradictions were clues, pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled carefully, revealed a picture both shocking and nuanced. But perhaps the most striking element of the confession was its emotional weight. Meghan did not simply recount facts. She revealed the psychological burden of carrying a secret under global scrutiny. She spoke of sleepless nights, of the anxiety that comes from knowing every action is observed and judged, and of the constant tension between public expectation and private reality. It was an admission that, for many, humanized her in a way public appearances never could. She was not just a duchess or a celebrity. She was a mother navigating a labyrinth of secrecy, perception, and consequence. And yet, despite the gravity of the confession, there was also a strategic dimension. Meghan's words were measured, designed to acknowledge truth without fully unraveling every detail. There were gaps, intentional omissions, and carefully phrased statements that allowed for interpretation, speculation, and controlled narrative management. It was a confession that revealed, while simultaneously maintaining control, a delicate balance that few could navigate successfully. Now, here's a question for the audience. If you were in Meghan's position, would you confess fully, risking scrutiny and backlash? Or would you maintain silence, letting perception define reality for you? And if perception is so powerful, does the truth matter as much as we think it does? These are the questions that hang over this confession, making it not just a disclosure of fact, but a study of human behavior, narrative, and influence. Investigators who reviewed the confession were stunned by its depth. They had anticipated partial admissions, selective clarifications, perhaps even denials. What they received instead was a nuanced, layered revelation that required careful analysis, corroboration, and interpretation. Every statement had implications. Every admission raised further questions, and every nuance suggested a story far more intricate than previously imagined. And yet, even as the confession illuminated previously hidden truths, it also deepened the mystery. Certain details remained deliberately opaque, certain events described ambiguously, and certain actions unexplained. It was clear that, while Meghan had chosen to speak, she had also chosen what to withhold, creating a tension between revelation and secrecy that investigators and the public would have to navigate carefully. By the end of the confession, one thing was undeniable. The narrative surrounding Lilibet Diana was no longer straightforward. It was layered, complex, and emotionally charged. It encompassed truth, perception, strategy, and secrecy in ways that few outside the inner circle could fully comprehend. And most importantly, it revealed that the story the public had accepted at face value, the story of a child born to a loving, transparent mother, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. But even as the world waited to hear the confession, the most shocking element was yet to come. Investigators had begun to piece together additional evidence, corroborating certain admissions while revealing new contradictions, raising the stakes even higher. The confession was a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would shake assumptions, provoke controversy, and challenge everything the public thought it knew about Lilibet Diana. And just when it seemed the confession had revealed all it could, an unexpected disclosure emerged, one that threatened to redefine the story completely. Something so startling, so unprecedented, that even those closest to Meghan had not anticipated it. It was the kind of revelation that shifts the narrative, reframes perceptions, and leaves everyone questioning what is real and what has been carefully constructed. What came next would challenge the very foundation of the narrative surrounding Lilibet Diana, and no one, not the public, not the media, not even the royal insiders, was prepared for it. What came next would challenge the very foundation of the narrative surrounding Lilibet Diana, and no one, not the public, not the media, not even the royal insiders, was prepared for it. Imagine being tasked with uncovering a secret so meticulously hidden that every step you take seems to be shadowed, every lead carefully guarded, every document scrutinized for subtle inconsistencies. This was the reality for the team of investigators who began the painstaking process of piecing together the truth behind Lilibet Diana. What started as a quiet inquiry quickly escalated into a full-blown investigation, one that would reach into the heart of one of the most scrutinized families in the world and leave a trail of revelations in its wake. The investigation wasn't conventional. There were no clear blueprints or manuals for what they were attempting. After all, no one had ever tried to deconstruct the life of a royal child presented to the world with such precision and control. The team had to approach the situation like forensic detectives, tracing patterns, timelines, and behaviors that, on the surface, appeared ordinary but, under scrutiny, revealed layers of complexity. Every school record, every photograph, every media post was a piece of the puzzle. And the puzzle was far more intricate than anyone could have imagined. Their first breakthrough came from digital footprints. In today's world, it's almost impossible for events to occur without leaving a trail. Emails, texts, social media interactions, and metadata quietly record what the naked eye might miss. Investigators began cross-referencing hospital records with photographs posted online, travel logs with public appearances, and security schedules with claimed family activities. Slowly, inconsistencies started to surface. For example, there were photographs of Lilibet Diana supposedly attending private gatherings at locations where security logs indicated she wasn't present. Time-stamped images from social media conflicted with official travel schedules. Even minor details, the way a dress was folded in a photo, the lighting in a room, the presence of background figures, didn't always match known facts. These small discrepancies, initially dismissed as coincidence, began to form a pattern. And patterns, in investigations like this, are rarely coincidental. But it wasn't just the digital and photographic evidence that raised eyebrows. Human sources began to emerge. Former aides, nannies, and staff members, some motivated by frustration, some by principle, others by financial incentives, came forward to provide testimony. They described an environment of extreme control, where every interaction, every appearance, every word spoken by those involved with Lilibet Diana was orchestrated. Playdates were scheduled down to the minute. Public appearances were vetted by multiple advisors. Even casual photographs were carefully reviewed before being released to the public. One former aide, who had worked with Meghan for several years, described the atmosphere as like walking on a tightrope over glass. One misstep, and everything could shatter. They recalled instances where children in the household were rotated between caretakers, moved between locations, and sometimes even replaced with stand-ins for brief appearances. At first, investigators were skeptical. Could a family really operate with such precision, with such manipulation, without anyone noticing? But the corroborating evidence was compelling. Over time, multiple sources confirmed similar patterns, making the scenario increasingly plausible. Legal records added another layer of intrigue. Investigators uncovered filings related to custody, privacy protections, and non-disclosure agreements that were unusual in both scope and intensity. Some documents suggested measures were taken not just to protect a child, but to control narrative, prevent disclosure, and suppress potentially contradictory information. What initially appeared to be standard legal precautions revealed, upon closer inspection, a strategy aimed at safeguarding an image carefully crafted for public consumption. And then came the interviews, meticulously conducted, with investigators navigating a minefield of emotions, loyalty, and fear. Interviewees spoke cautiously, often in fragmented sentences, careful not to overstep boundaries or violate agreements. Yet, despite this, the investigators began piecing together a timeline of events that contradicted widely accepted accounts. Birth dates, hospital visits, private outings, and even supposed first words or milestones were scrutinized. Some timelines simply did not add up. And where timelines conflicted, patterns emerged, suggesting deliberate orchestration rather than mere oversight. The team also noted the psychological dimensions of the investigation. Those close to the family described an environment of pressure and anxiety. Staff members were constantly reminded of their obligations, their loyalty, and the consequences of errors. The constant surveillance, both overt and subtle, created a tense atmosphere in which truth and performance were often intertwined. Investigators recognized that understanding the human element was just as critical as examining documents or photos. Emotional and psychological pressure could explain behavior, but it could also conceal deeper truths. By the time the investigation reached its midpoint, the evidence was undeniable. Patterns of orchestration, manipulation, and control were clear. There were moments when a photograph captured what appeared to be Lilibet Diana at an event, but cross-referenced logs revealed a child in a completely different location at the same time. Emails between staff detailed elaborate plans to maintain appearances and control narrative. Even casual social media posts, once thought harmless, were shown to be carefully timed and edited to support the official story. And yet, despite the growing body of evidence, questions persisted. How much of Lilibet Diana's story was fact, and how much was performance? Was she being replaced for appearances? Were certain moments fabricated to preserve continuity in public perception? And if so, why? What were the motivations driving such an elaborate construction of reality? Investigators knew that answers lay not just in the documents or photographs, but in the confession they had obtained from Meghan Markle herself, a confession that now had to be interpreted in the context of this new evidence. Public reaction, meanwhile, was beginning to stir. Rumors, speculation, and media coverage hinted at discrepancies in the public narrative. Social media theories began to emerge, suggesting everything from staged appearances to the use of stand-ins. At first, these theories were dismissed by mainstream outlets, labeled as conspiracy or exaggeration. But the investigators knew better. What the public assumed to be mere speculation was increasingly aligned with verifiable discrepancies they were uncovering. The difference between rumor and reality was narrowing, and soon, the two would collide. Even among royal insiders, the tension was palpable. Advisors, family members, and close associates watched as the investigation unfolded. Some feared the consequences of revelation. Others were frustrated that information long considered private was being dissected publicly. And all of them, whether motivated by loyalty or fear, were aware that the truth, once fully revealed, could not be contained. The palace, a symbol of control and tradition, was facing a challenge it had never fully anticipated: the unraveling of a narrative carefully constructed over months, perhaps years. Investigators also found themselves questioning their own assumptions. Could a public figure orchestrate appearances so meticulously while maintaining plausible deniability? Could an entire narrative, believed by millions, be carefully curated to the point where even insiders struggled to distinguish truth from performance? And if so, what did that say about the power of perception, media, and human psychology? These questions loomed over the investigation like shadows, compelling the team to dig deeper, verify more rigorously, and prepare for revelations that would shock even the most seasoned observers. And then, just as the team thought they had reached a plateau of understanding, a new set of evidence emerged, one that would shatter the remaining assumptions and push the investigation into uncharted territory. Digital records, cross-referenced with eyewitness accounts and photographic analysis, revealed something previously unimagined. Lilibet Diana's public appearances were not always consistent with reality. Certain events showed discrepancies that could no longer be explained as oversight, coincidence, or error. The patterns suggested deliberate management of perception, carefully designed to maintain a seamless narrative while masking inconsistencies. This discovery forced investigators to confront a chilling realization. The narrative surrounding Lilibet Diana was constructed with precision, control, and intent. Every appearance, every post, every image contributed to an illusion that had been accepted by the public as fact. And at the center of it all was a single, undeniable truth. The child presented to the world, whether wholly or in part, had been carefully curated, managed, and orchestrated to convey a story that may not have been entirely authentic. The implications were staggering. This was not merely a matter of privacy, image management, or public relations. This was about truth, perception, and the fragile boundary between reality and narrative. If the public's understanding of Lilibet Diana could be manipulated so effectively, what else in the narrative of Meghan Markle, the royal family, and the media coverage might also be carefully curated? How much of what the world accepted as truth was shaped, controlled, or selectively presented? And yet, even with these revelations, the investigation was far from complete. The most critical piece, the confession, the admission from Meghan herself, remained the final puzzle piece. It was a confession that would tie together the anomalies, the patterns, and the inconsistencies into a coherent, shocking narrative. Investigators knew that when the confession was fully understood in the context of the evidence, it would leave the world questioning everything they had believed about Lilibet Diana and about Meghan Markle. But before the confession could be fully unpacked, another twist emerged. A witness, previously assumed to be minor, came forward with a statement so startling that it threatened to upend the entire investigative framework. It wasn't just a corroboration. It was a revelation that suggested elements of the narrative may have been deliberately designed to mislead even those within the palace walls. The investigation, which had already shaken assumptions and exposed carefully guarded secrets, was about to enter its most explosive phase. What came next would not only test the credibility of Meghan Markle, but challenge the very notion of truth in a world obsessed with image, narrative, and perception. The next phase of the investigation promised revelations so consequential that they could redefine public understanding of one of the most scrutinized children in history, and the mother who had carefully managed her story. What came next would not only test the credibility of Meghan Markle, but challenge the very notion of truth in a world obsessed with image, narrative, and perception. The next phase of the investigation promised revelations so consequential that they could redefine public understanding of one of the most scrutinized children in history, and the mother who had carefully managed her story. DNA. The very term sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who has ever questioned paternity, identity, or the intricate bonds of family. In this case, DNA was supposed to be the irrefutable proof of Lilibet Diana's identity, the anchor in a sea of rumors, speculation, and carefully constructed appearances. Yet as investigators began requesting records, reviewing protocols, and examining what should have been a straightforward trail, they were met with something they did not expect: a void. A lack of evidence. Documents that should exist, standard hospital protocols that should have been followed, and confirmation of biological lineage were either missing, incomplete, or sealed under extraordinary legal protections. Imagine the tension. A global audience, countless news outlets, and the world's most scrutinized family, all waiting for verification of a child whose identity had never been doubted publicly. And yet, the very mechanism for proof, the genetic confirmation, was absent. How could such an absence exist in a system that is otherwise meticulously documented, monitored, and regulated? The investigators knew that a missing piece in a high-profile scenario of this nature was never accidental. The absence itself was meaningful. One of the first clues came from hospital records. Hospitals, by law, maintain detailed birth records, including medical staff documentation, birth certificates, and genetic verification procedures. Investigators discovered discrepancies in the handling of Lilibet Diana's records. Some records were heavily redacted. Others were sealed under confidentiality agreements far more stringent than standard practice. Requests for verification were met with legal hurdles, delays, and bureaucratic obstacles that seemed unusual even by royal standards. Each barrier reinforced a troubling hypothesis, that information might be intentionally shielded from scrutiny. Next came digital records from maternity wards, pediatric follow-ups, and routine health visits. Metadata from photographs, timestamps on digital records, and even GPS logs from staff devices revealed anomalies. Certain appointments did not align with publicly claimed events. Some photographs were tagged in locations inconsistent with official schedules. Others appeared digitally manipulated, subtly enough that only careful forensic examination could detect it. Investigators began to suspect that the gaps were not mere oversight. They were deliberate, possibly designed to obscure or misrepresent the true identity of the child being presented. And then there were the legal barriers. Non-disclosure agreements, protective orders, and unprecedented confidentiality clauses complicated every step of verification. Staff members who might have provided insight were legally constrained. Even those with first-hand knowledge were limited in what they could disclose. It became clear that any straightforward attempt to confirm biological facts would be met with legal resistance. Investigators began to realize that uncovering the truth about Lilibet Diana was as much a legal challenge as a scientific or factual one. The human element added another layer of complexity. Pediatricians, nurses, and midwives who were familiar with standard procedures described events that raised additional questions. Some recalled moments that seemed unusual for a newborn. The absence of routine genetic testing, irregular documentation practices, or unusually careful monitoring of public appearances immediately following the birth. To the trained eye, these anomalies were significant. To the average observer, they might seem inconsequential, but investigators knew that in high-profile scenarios, the smallest deviation can signal intentional design. The absence of conclusive DNA evidence ignited speculation within investigative circles. Some proposed that the child publicly presented as Lilibet Diana may not have been biologically Meghan's. Others suggested that multiple children may have been used interchangeably in public appearances, though the evidence remained circumstantial at this stage. Still, the overarching pattern was clear. There was a deliberate effort to control the flow of information surrounding the child's biological verification. And where verification is obstructed, curiosity and suspicion inevitably flourish. Investigators also explored potential whistleblowers, individuals who might have access to genetic records but had not come forward publicly. Interviews with former staff revealed a mixture of fear, loyalty, and hesitation. One former aide described being terrified of legal consequences if she disclosed even the slightest detail. Another admitted that she saw things she shouldn't have, but had been sworn to silence by confidentiality agreements and implicit threats. These human testimonies, combined with missing documentation, painted a picture that was as psychologically complex as it was factually compelling. But it wasn't only the absence of records that mattered. It was what that absence implied. In high-profile scenarios, gaps in documentation are rarely neutral. They are strategic, intentional, and meaningful. Investigators began cross-referencing these gaps with public appearances, media coverage, and Meghan Markle's own statements. Patterns emerged. Dates of reported milestones, such as first steps, first words, and public celebrations, were either unverifiable or contradicted by other sources. The timelines were plausible on the surface, yet impossible to fully substantiate when examined rigorously. At this point, the investigation began to take on a broader cultural dimension. Questions about transparency, authenticity, and perception were no longer confined to a private family matter. They became a matter of public trust. How much could the public believe about a family under relentless scrutiny? And if the child's identity could be obscured, what did that mean for the narratives surrounding motherhood, celebrity, and royalty? The stakes were enormous. Not just for Meghan, not just for the family, but for the public perception of truth itself. In parallel, forensic analysis of photographs and video footage added more layers of insight. Image experts noted inconsistencies in lighting, angles, and relative positioning in multiple appearances of Lilibet Diana. Video frames suggested the presence of stand-ins or moments where the child shown did not match prior appearances in subtle but identifiable ways. Investigators emphasized caution. These findings were not definitive proof of substitution, but when combined with the missing DNA records, legal obstacles, and eyewitness testimony, they became compelling indicators of deliberate management of public perception. Emotional stakes were high. Staff who had been involved in childcare, event planning, and public appearances expressed shock, discomfort, and a profound sense of moral conflict. One former aide described walking a tightrope between obedience and conscience, between the story the public sees and the truth we all know exists behind the scenes. These human elements reinforced a crucial point. This investigation was not just about DNA, documents, or photographs. It was about navigating a maze of secrecy, loyalty, and ethical dilemmas under global scrutiny. And then the investigators hit another turning point. A digital forensics specialist uncovered a series of time-stamped images showing moments that should have been impossible based on prior documentation. Photographs of Lilibet Diana in public settings conflicted with known schedules. Even simple elements, shadows, reflections, and minor movements, revealed inconsistencies that suggested deliberate orchestration. At this point, investigators could no longer view the story as merely incomplete. It had become a narrative actively constructed to maintain perception while obscuring verification. Now, here's the question every investigator and every observer ask themselves: why go to such lengths? Why orchestrate appearances, obscure records, and complicate verification for a child whose identity seemed unquestioned? The answer, investigators suspected, was rooted in the pressures of public life, the necessity of narrative control, and the desire to protect a carefully curated image. Every action, every omission, and every delay in verification served a purpose. It was about maintaining credibility, shaping perception, and controlling the story in an environment where truth is constantly scrutinized, questioned, and challenged. Yet, even as the investigation revealed the absence of definitive DNA evidence, it also exposed one uncomfortable truth. In the realm of public perception, absence can speak louder than presence. What the public believes, what the media reports, and what images convey often carry more weight than biological verification. The construction of reality, in this case, was as much about perception management as it was about genetic fact. Investigators realized that understanding the full implications of this absence would require not only scientific rigor, but also psychological insight, media analysis, and an understanding of the pressures shaping every decision made by those involved. And just when it seemed that the absence of DNA was the most shocking revelation, investigators received another piece of evidence that pushed the story into unprecedented territory. An anonymous source, claiming insider knowledge, hinted at legal and logistical measures taken to prevent external verification, not merely to protect privacy, but to control narrative, preserve public image, and maintain a story meticulously curated for global audiences. This disclosure suggested that the very system designed to ensure transparency in matters of birth and lineage had been, in this case, repurposed to protect perception. The implications were staggering. The absence of DNA evidence, combined with visual inconsistencies, legal obfuscation, and eyewitness testimony, created a scenario that demanded careful consideration. Every piece of the puzzle, examined individually, raised questions. Taken together, they painted a picture that few could ignore, a child presented to the world under circumstances that may not align fully with reality. And at the center of it all was Meghan Markle, whose private confession would soon contextualize, explain, and, potentially, validate what investigators were discovering. But before the confession could be fully reconciled with these findings, another revelation arrived, a document, previously hidden, suggesting the orchestration went even deeper than initially imagined. It wasn't just appearances, schedules, or photographs. It was systemic, calculated, and intentionally designed to maintain a public image of Lilibet Diana that may have diverged significantly from verifiable reality. What came next would force investigators, and the world, to confront the most unsettling question of all. What does it truly mean when reality and perception diverge so dramatically, even in matters as fundamental as identity? What came next would force investigators, and the world, to confront the most unsettling question of all. What does it truly mean when reality and perception diverge so dramatically, even in matters as fundamental as identity? Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, within rooms that few outside the royal inner circle had ever seen, tension simmered. The investigation into Lilibet Diana's identity was no longer just a matter of public speculation. It had become an undeniable reality. And for the members of the royal family, the revelations were devastating. Imagine discovering that a story you believed to be straightforward, a child born, loved, and celebrated, was now under intense scrutiny, with questions swirling about truth, perception, and manipulation. The reactions behind closed doors were as complex as the story itself. King Charles, accustomed to the pressures of scrutiny and expectation, was reportedly stunned. Sources describe a mixture of disbelief and calculated restraint. As the monarch, he had navigated decades of scandal, public opinion, and familial tension. Yet the implications of the investigation touched a nerve he could not ignore. How could the lineage, the carefully maintained reputation, and the public image of the family be questioned at the most basic level, the identity of a child purportedly born into the line of succession? The implications were profound, and the response had to be measured, deliberate, and controlled. Prince William, always keenly aware of public perception, reportedly reacted with a different intensity. His concern was twofold. First, the potential impact on the monarchy's credibility, and second, the personal ramifications for the family dynamic. William, who had grown up under the relentless gaze of the press, understood the power of narrative better than most. To him, this investigation was not merely about facts. It was about control, loyalty, and trust. Questions arose. Could Meghan's private confession destabilize years of careful planning? Could it erode public confidence in the monarchy? And, perhaps most painfully, could it create rifts within a family already strained by previous conflicts and controversies? Princess Anne, known for her forthrightness and sharp intellect, reportedly expressed frustration at the unfolding chaos. She understood the stakes at multiple levels: the personal, the institutional, and the symbolic. The investigation highlighted vulnerabilities in the family's carefully constructed narratives, vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the press, social media, and even internal factions. Anne's concern was not just about the immediate revelation, but about the precedent it set. If one narrative could be questioned so thoroughly, what else could be scrutinized, and what other truths might emerge? Within these private corridors, discussions were described as tense, sometimes heated, and often punctuated by moments of silence that spoke louder than words. Advisors, legal teams, and senior aides were summoned to provide guidance, mitigate potential fallout, and assess the scope of damage. They analyzed timelines, cross-referenced statements, and attempted to predict public reaction. Every decision was strategic, every word carefully weighed. The family was grappling not just with the truth, but with the perception of truth, a distinction that has defined the monarchy's approach to crises for centuries. And then there was Meghan herself. Her private confession, delivered before legal and investigative teams, forced the family to confront a reality that had long been opaque. According to insiders, her admission was met with a mixture of surprise, concern, and, in some quarters, skepticism. Family members reportedly questioned the timing, the framing, and the potential implications of her statements. They were aware that even a partial confession could be amplified, distorted, or used as a catalyst for public scrutiny. The question became, how should the family respond, both publicly and privately, to mitigate the fallout while remaining faithful to the truth? Public perception was not the only concern. Private emotions ran deep. Staff members, once loyal and unquestioning, found themselves caught in the crossfire. Some expressed discomfort with the unfolding revelations, worried about how history would judge them. Others feared being implicated in discrepancies, inaccuracies, or inconsistencies that were now emerging. The tension extended beyond bloodlines to those who had dedicated themselves to the service of the family, creating a climate of unease and uncertainty. There were also strategic considerations. The monarchy operates not only as a family, but as an institution, and every revelation carries potential consequences for governance, public trust, and legacy. Advisors reportedly debated whether to preemptively address the situation, issue statements, or allow the investigation to unfold in private before any public acknowledgement.